I'm Merit Cudkowicz. I'm chair of neurology at Mass General Hospital at Harvard Medical School, and I direct the Sean M. Healy and AMG Center for ALS at Mass General Hospital.
And I'm Brad Hyman. I'm also a neurologist here at Mass General and Harvard Medical School. I'm vice chair for research of the department with Merit, and I direct our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center.
Amazing. I'm going to actually pass it to Tom to introduce Run to Revive, but just briefly, Rob Burns. I initially connected with Brad in 2017 as we were exploring who we wanted to partner with and pass our funds to, and was very impressed by you guys. And some of the things, I'm reading back at my notes from 2017, and we talked about the H factor. So I'd love to bring that back up in terms of your centers being the top cited individuals in the world, which is pretty incredible. And also, of course, being one of 10 centers of excellence for Alzheimer's. There's a lot of different factors as to why we chose you guys in the first place. So I guess before introducing Run to Revive, we just kind of love to hear from you 5 years later now, what makes you guys stand out from the crowd. So I would love for you to brag. I know that's uncomfortable sometimes, but please just tell us our supporters, why this is the best choice for where the money goes.
Well, I can tell you how fantastic Merit is. So
vice versa.
Merit has just done unbelievable. She's just revolutionized how we approach treating ALS. And ALS is, of course, an awful, awful, awful disease. I mean, patients go from the first symptom to literally dead in months, not years, like really quickly. And it's just a devastating, awful, awful, awful path. The underlying science for what goes wrong in ALS has really been exciting in the past decade. And so there's all these clues, but converting that science into a therapy that'll help our patients has been tough. And Merit's developed these platform trial models, which are just completely innovative in how you do a clinical trial. She's developed this whole network of institutions that work together. She's developed all these parallel systems in which more and more drugs can be tested sort of simultaneously to see what works. And they've had some success. I mean, I'm so thrilled about the Amylyx data, Merit. I mean, it's not a cure yet, right? I mean, we don't quite get people back to, not having the disease at all. But man, the thought that anything would make a difference, even 5 years ago, was just blue sky dream, and it's happening. It's so exciting.
Yeah. So the drug Brad is talking about, AMX 035, is now under FDA review for full approval. And we'll know on June 29th, and we'll have the FDA answer. It's also under review in Canada and Europe. So
not that you have that circled on your calendar, do you?
Exactly. But what I think really makes MGH great, and why I've spent my whole career here, and Brad has spent most of his career here, came from Iowa here, is really the fundamental basic science that happens in the labs of our faculty, and then the link to the patients and the clinical trialists. So, for the things that Brad mentioned in ALS, we couldn't have done without this real network of scientists, both here and throughout the world. And the same thing's happening in Alzheimer's that Brad leads. We have kind of the world-class Alzheimer's scientists here, and they are developing models and ideas of how to treat people with Alzheimer's, but also how do you intervene early, how do you diagnose early, and how do you lead good to prevention. And that's and they've made just huge progress there. So, and then these groups intermingle, because what we might discover in Alzheimer's can help in ALS, and vice versa. And so we're, I would say that now there's a little corner of Brad's lab that's also working on ALS. And same for some of our ALS physicians are working on Alzheimer's. And it's that cross connection that makes things just go faster and more hopeful.
And I'd just pick up on that last point, is that I think all of us here, we have, the clinical experience to know just how devastating these diseases are to our patients. And that gives us a sense of urgency and honestly, a sense that we don't have time for politics. We don't have time for, little quibbles. We don't have time for silos. Like, if I learn something that I think might help Merit, boy, she finds out about it that millisecond, and vice versa. And that sort of community spirit of, we have a mission that's bigger than, the individual little silo of a laboratory or whatever. I think that really puts us in it makes it a fantastic place to work. Merit said I moved here in 1989, sort of thinking that maybe we'd stay here 2 or 3, 4 years because, it was Mass General after all. And, I lost all my hair here. So
there seems to be so much good collaboration going on. And, Merit, you mentioned the recent milestone with AMX 0035 through Amylyx. And that was actually through the ALS platform trial that you're heading up. Is that correct?
Actually, it was right before that. So, I remember the day I met the two founders. They were two students from Brown University, and they reached out to another one of our faculty members, Dr. Tansey, to run their idea about combining these drugs actually for Alzheimer's. And I happened to be at the lab that day, and he introduced them to me. And I do confess to kind of convince him to go after ALS first, but they're also testing their drug for Alzheimer's. And then, I introduced them to our consortium of sites and scientists, and which really just took them in and said, you have kind of a good idea, but you've never run a trial before, done any of the science, which they really hadn't. And it was with that community that we tested the drug, and it worked. And then the platform trial actually came right after that, because we started to feel like there were so many companies and so many labs working on ALS that if we were going to test each drug by itself, that we'd be here like 50 years later, and that we needed to innovate how to do it faster. And then we started it. And now we have 5 drugs that we're testing in the platform trial.
Amazing. So that collaboration is actually managing to, work in neurology across multiple bases is opening up, hopefully, new opportunities. And the Act for ALS bill, which was a huge, milestone for research, right? And that was authorizing, I think it was 100 million annually to implement, investigational therapies. How much is an impact on that have on the work that sort of yourself and Brad, you're doing? Do you get the benefit of an act passing such as that?
I hope we will. It just passed, and so the money hasn't yet been distributed, but we're all waiting to find out how. But I think what that addresses is this other issue that happens in Alzheimer's and ALS, is that often the clinical trials are recruiting people early in the illness. Just because you can get a signal in a shorter time, and it'll help everybody, but that leaves out, maybe half the people who with the illness who would like to be part of research. And so the Act for ALS is a way to fund access for those people, and to do it in a way that you're still learning about the illness and contributing to research, but providing broader access. So that's something that we're doing and hoping to apply for some of those resources to help.
Yeah, it follows on a similar act that Congress passed maybe 7 or 8 years ago on Alzheimer's disease. And I actually served as the research chair of the NAPA committee that oversaw that for the national implementation of it. And that was really exciting to see how we rolled that out. But it was an opportunity to really try to reward synergies and leverage what's good at this place and what's good at this place, and just create programs, just be innovative about, again, how to move things faster. I mean, there's this sense of urgency that Merit and I share. which like, let's just do it, you know?
Yeah. Actually, I don't know if are you talking about the National Alzheimer's Project Act or
Yeah, NAPA.
So I'm curious about that. There was a very specific goal in that act to be able to prevent, and maybe I'm saying this incorrect, so I'd rather you address this, but from what I understood about it, to be able to prevent and cure Alzheimer's by 2025. With 3 years away from that, how do you feel about it now? And are we on pace, or what's going on? And it seems like and just to put a second question in there, the ALS Act, from what I can see so far, doesn't have those kind of specific goals connected to it.
So a little sort of, background here. I always thought that putting a particular deadline on scientific discovery and clinical outcomes was optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
Like Mom Nature likes to hold her secrets tight and doesn't always like to tell you what, she doesn't always answer the questions. She's like that, troll at the bridge, right? You gotta ask the question right, and you gotta know that, you gotta get the answers right, or you get thrown off the bridge into the deep water. And you just can't know till you do the experiment. So what we were told, as the scientists on the committee were told, was that from a sort of, at the time, the politics of it were, if you said to Congress, gee, we'd like you to give us a lot of money kind of forever till we get around to being tired of using a lot of money, like that's we're not going to write a blank check. That's just dead in the water. We got to have some structure to it. And yes, everybody does understand that this is a blue sky goal, that this is, we're going to aim for there, and we'll assess how we are when we get there. But in fact, and this is quite controversial, but we do have a drug that's FDA approved that well beat the target time.
Right.
Now it's still, I think, an open question whether that drug ultimately will be effective in preventing or curing Alzheimer's disease. And in my view, that data, just don't exist. Right now, it doesn't look like it dramatically changes the symptoms of patients who are already impaired. And the trial that asks whether or not it can prevent the symptoms developing is still underway. But in fact, we have a drug that hits a major target of the disease and gets rid of it. And now Mom Nature's going to tell us whether that was the right thing to try to do. But the fact that we're even at that point for one target means that we have a roadmap to get to that point for all the other targets that scientists have been working on. So we have a roadmap for how to get to that point for tau. We have a roadmap for how to get to that target for inflammation. We have a roadmap for how to get to that target for microglial biological targets that are, weren't even dreamed of 5 years ago. And so all that bubbling up of information from the scientific labs, here and elsewhere, right? I mean, that's what's leading to the identification of targets. And now we have a roadmap of how to get from here to there, which just didn't exist 8 years ago. So I think NAP has been a huge success. I sure wish that the original data from, Aduhelm showed that, people got younger and smarter and, better looking, every time they got an infusion. But, right, it's the first generation of every drug for every disease we've ever tried to get at. And, maybe penicillin is the exception, just plain, wasn't perfect. And then you iterate on top of that. And anybody who expected that we would have magic, hit right away, they were being optimistic.
I agree with everything you said, but particularly the last statement that we know from other diseases that, particularly oncology, where maybe the first drug didn't do that much, but it got on the market, opens up the field. You develop new biomarkers, better drugs, and I hope that'll be the case for aducanumab and for the AMX035 for ALS. The Act for ALS doesn't have a deadline, but it does have in there money for the FDA to fund grants to fill in the gaps of the things that we need to get drugs approved faster. And I think that's very unique. And I think about a quarter of the money goes for that, and the rest for this improved access and knowledge. So I think it'll be transformational, just like the NAPA was.
Yeah, I noticed in one of your videos, actually, Merritt, you said, the pipeline of treatments, from the pharmaceutical companies needs to grow and expand to allow you guys to keep testing. Is I guess, the exposure and ALS and Alzheimer's in the news through these acts getting signed, are you going to hopefully see an increase in that, or a motivation to produce products for you to test?
Yes, and we're seeing it already in the ALS world. I think it's still largely driven by the science, that there's targets to go after, but also the regulatory pathway has changed. And I think in a positive way is that it's moving more towards what happens in oncology, where if you have a drug that is positive, let's say in phase 2, you can get an accelerated approval so that you can market that drug while you're doing a second replication trial. And they can do that because they have good, surrogate markers. And so they have high chance of success. And they've only pulled a few drugs off the market that way. But we need that kind of approach in Alzheimer's and ALS. And that's, I think, the direction we're seeing the FDA go. And that's attracting more companies. Right, because now they don't have to do, $100 million, $200 million, very long studies twice. There might be a faster path. And it's a big change, but I personally think it's a positive change for these serious illnesses. And even if there's a risk that we might get a drug on the market that doesn't do anything and it gets withdrawn a year or two later, that I think that's okay for a serious illness.
Yeah. The big thing about everyone who's linked to Run to Revive, that they all have a strong why, right? And why they're doing this. And our mission is to continue to fight against Alzheimer's and ALS. We encourage people to push their mind and body in support of those who have maybe lost the ability to do so. So I want to talk about habits a little bit, because, when we're talking about preventative measures, diet, exercise, sleep, caffeine consumption, I know in the world of ALS, especially, Merritt, there's still a disproportionate number of people impacted with either a military or heavy industrial background, maybe an exposure to environmental toxins. Can you talk a little bit about, are we doing or having an impact negatively on numbers increasing of people suffering with ALS and Alzheimer's? And, from not many of us have the opportunity to work closely with a scientific lab and research studies like you guys do. So kind of sharing that message to our population and supporters as well.
Yeah. We know some of the risk factors for ALS, but not all of them. And we might know, I think, we'll hear from Brad, that more things that might prevent or delay Alzheimer's than we know for ALS. But we need to do those studies. And we're actually looking to the Alzheimer's field and how they've done it to do it in ALS. We do know, as you said, that people who are like NFL players, they're like 4 times higher risk of ALS, or soccer players are 6-fold. So there's something about those sports, we don't know whether it's the head trauma or the sport itself, but those are the biggest risk factors other than age. So I think the prevention still is around, taking good care of yourself, and the same things maybe for like Alzheimer's, about sleep, good diet, obviously not hitting your head. But there's probably many more things we could do to prevent the illness. So we're actually starting a study called Prevent ALS, which is looking at people at high risk for it who carry the genes, and and we know that some people who carry the gene mutation that might cause ALS, they don't get it, so in families. So trying to figure out why some people are resistant to it as a way to understand how to prevent it for the bigger population as well.
Yeah, so I'll just echo a lot of that. There's in Alzheimer's disease, there's 2 observations that we've made clinically that we're now really trying to drill down on in a research way. The first is, of course, that some people come to the doctor, they have some symptoms, you make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, you see them back the next year, and they're kind of doing the same. You see them back 2 years later, and they're, they're older, but they're doing them, pretty much the same. Clearly still impaired, but not a huge. And other people, it's just awful. It's just a rapid progression that puts them into deep trouble quickly. And sort of the extremes of that is this population that my colleague Teresa Gomez-Isla, who runs our memory disorder clinic, calls the resilient individuals. And they're people who, despite biomarkers that have plaques and tangles or whatever, still remain cognitively normal, and they're rare. I mean, it's the unusual individual who has all the laboratory tests that point to Alzheimer's, but are clinically normal, but they exist out there. And so sort of a pole is resilient versus rapid progressors. And in the last 2 years, we've been able to demonstrate some of the biochemical features that separate those individuals. And actually, we think are now able to anticipate who's going to be a fast progressor and who's going to be a slow progressor. And it's our hope that understanding the biology of those markers will allow us to say, okay, well, that's activation of this enzyme that's associated with this phenotype, that's associated with propagation faster, that's associated with more rapid progression. Let's target drugs that aim at that particular thing. So it's a more nuanced approach than yes, no. It's sort of like how much. And I right now, between genetics and some of the data that we've generated in our own laboratories, we can account for about 25-30% of the variance in rate of progression. So that's not all of it by any stretch of the imagination, right? But 5 years ago, we were at this much. And we sort of feel like if we just chip away at it and we design our studies in a way that allow us to look at this rate of progression changes, that we'll learn more and more. So it's actually a pretty exciting time.
Yeah, I want to drill down more and wrap up with like the vision. But just before I do, one quick question on habits. Is there one or two things that you feel really confident about that if somebody was to change their lifestyle, here's what you would absolutely encourage?
You can go first, Brad. And then
Okay, I think both of us sort of feel like, and maybe this isn't deep science here, but the more damage that the nervous system has from other things, the less additional damage it needs from the ALS process or the Alzheimer process to develop symptoms. And so in Alzheimer's disease, for example, there's been several studies now that suggest that what we usually think of as cardiovascular health sorts of things, right? So exercise, sleep, the hypertension, bringing your blood pressure to not just the 120/80 that we're all supposed to be at, but even sort of lower than that, bringing your cholesterol levels not just below 200, but down to 160. I'm just sort of don't take those as the gold standard, but right. I mean, the whole notion of let's optimize all the infrastructure, and therefore, best case, it has an underlying change in the biology. Worst case, you're still making it healthier. So it's more able to be, to quote Teresa, resilient to the challenges that come with age. So those are the main things right now, is the heart healthy things, with blood pressure being the primary readout there, but even variability of blood pressure seems to be a big key. And so which medicines, there's a trial now to judge whether or not some hypertension medicines are better at keeping the variability of blood pressure, little spikes that happen during the course of the day, under better control than others. And so it's a way of thinking about the disease process that is brand new and I think really interesting.
Yeah, I'll add that I think all those same things for ALS of kind of good sleep habits, gut exercise, good nutrition. There's been a few studies now by epidemiologists who follow people without any illness for decades. And then they look at who gets what disease. And they have now, about a couple hundred people who have gotten ALS in these large data sets. And they've shown that, people take vitamin E every day seem to be at 2/3 the risk of getting ALS. And they've also shown the blood pressure control, it lowers your risk. So, but these are early days, but it's starting to get a theme of general good health, like Brad said, for your heart and the rest of your body is also good for your brain and preventing these neurodegenerative diseases.
Thank you so much. I know we're at the end of our time together, but would like to wrap up with the hope for the future. Like what's been apparent throughout this is we've learned so much in the last 5 years. And I think that goes with the theme of like research into the brain is just accelerating at such a fast pace now than what, and I don't know, you probably correct me on the actual data, but we probably learned more in the last 10 years than the previous 100 years or something, right? So it's really happening right now. So what's the hope that you can give our supporters in terms of actually finding a cure? What are these technological discoveries and new things around CRISPR or DNA sequencing or gene editing and those kinds of things? And what impact does that have, if any, on Alzheimer's and ALS and getting to the end goal?
I'll say for ALS, there's 3 areas that really get me hopeful and excited. And they are just a huge pipeline of drugs that I think can slow or ultimately, halt the progression. And I don't think we're that far from those medications coming to the market. And then there's a whole group of technologies on how do you repair function? How do you reconnect the motor nerve to the muscle? And whether you're going to use, stem cell technology or CRISPR technology, but there are companies and academics working on that. And then it's the whole prevention. How do you just delay it or prevent it from ever starting? And that could use these CRISPR or gene therapy approaches for the genetic form, but ultimately also maybe for the sporadic form, if we can identify the right proteins to try to modulate. So, but the fact that people are even thinking about all 3 of those areas, preventing, repairing, and halting, is it's just transformational in ALS. We weren't talking about any of that a couple of years ago.
Yeah, ditto.
Well, we'll leave it there then. Thank you so much for the time. This was really incredible for us, and our supporters will appreciate it as well. So our goal this year is to double our impacts and donate $100,000 towards your work, and we have a strategy in place to hit that goal. So we appreciate everything you have done and are doing to paint a better future for all of us.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Can't do it without your support and your entire team. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Brad and Merritt.